Oh, we can give few, like 2 minutes for participants to enter the room.
And will someone introduce me? Who will
Yes, 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 I will.
Okay, perfect. So I don't say anything. I'm going to go on mute
yeah.
until you're finished. Sorry, I just
Okay.
didn't know.
Yeah. So yes, they finish in a different room. So 35.
Yeah, people is joining now.
Yeah. So we just wait 1 minute. The counter is going up.
Yeah, 52
okay.
right now. Okay, so.
Okay, maybe I start. Yeah, the people will join. So, hello everyone. It is an honor to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Una May O'Reilly. She is the leader of Alpha Group at MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab. Alpha focuses on machine learning technology, evolutionary algorithms, and data science for knowledge mining, prediction, analytics, and optimization. Alpha conducts research in cybersecurity, software analysis, MOOC, and medical technology. She has expertise in agile data science systems with rapid intelligence data analytic capabilities. Those systems span organization and visualization of raw data through to machine learning inference. She educates the forthcoming generation of data scientists, teaching them how to develop state-of-art techniques that address their challenges spanning data integration to knowledge extraction. She is recognized by ACM Special Interest Group on Genetic and Evolutionary Computation for her significant contributions, having been elected a Fellow of the International Society for Genetic and Evolutionary Computation. She has also served as Vice Chair of ACM, Special Interest Group on Genetic and Evolutionary Computation, and has served as Chair of the largest international evolutionary computation conference, GECO. She has also served on the GECO Business Committee, co-lead the 2006 and 2009 Genetic Programming Theory to Practice workshops, and co-chair EuroGP, the largest conference devoted to genetic programming. In 2013, ENAIC inaugurated the Women in Evolutionary Computation group in GECO. She received the Evo Star Award for Outstanding Achievements in Evolutionary Computation in Europe in 2013. And in 2018, ENAIC was recognized by Nature Research Journals for outstanding contributions in peer review. Recently, ACM's Special Interest Group on Genetic and Evolutionary Computation elected ENAIC for career recognition for scientific merit. She joined MIT as a member of the Artificial Intelligence Lab in 1998, and she is the author of over 100 academic papers. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to this seminar. It is a pleasure to have you here, and please, I let you the microphone to you.
Okay, well, I'm going to assume that everyone can see my first slide. And I want to greet all of you. It's a pleasure to be here virtually in a speaking series that highlights the achievements of women. So I especially like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me in that capacity. So if all my settings are in place and I'm not getting any negative feedback, I'll assume that I can start. I decided to go way back. So in freshman year of college, I learned how to program and these ideas that a computer, and an algorithm that I could write would allow me to execute results on a computer and get results that would vary based on the inputs and based on the control of the algorithm. And this whole idea of programming a computer really grabbed my attention. And I'm still, to this day, intrigued by how a computer can be helpful by behaving intelligently. So no doubt, like some of you in the audience today, I focus on AI, artificial intelligence. And AI to me is the quest to make computers as intelligent as humans and to make them intelligent in ways that humans are not, because they're silicon and digital, and we're neurons and biological, so one would expect differences. And there are many aspects of computational and human intelligence to study, with one informing the other, and vice versa. Of course, two important and typical topics are vision and language. But for me, learning has struck me as quintessential to intelligence. You have to learn in order to understand what you see, and we learn to communicate with language, after all. So I think it's arguable that without learning, something in a general sense is really not intelligent. One can't study every aspect of learning or context in which it occurs. I have to focus. So of late, I study stylized AI settings that are distinctive by particular properties. First, and most importantly, they feature intelligent adversaries. I consider competitors, or their tools, that have conflicting objectives. This implies that when they engage, in terms of outcomes, what's bad for one side, the roadrunner, is reciprocally good for the other, the coyote. And typically, I'm invested in environments which have adversarial behavior. And in those environments, you can talk about one side as favored, the good side, and the other is out of favor, the bad side. And you'll see me sort of have that connotation to the settings I study. Now, these engagements between competitors that I'm interested in, they occur in environments. They occur in environments where the adversaries' performances with respect to their objectives can be measured. And they also occur in terms where each adversary has a limited set of resources at hand. And there's some cost to a strategy they use to compete in terms of these resources. And quite frequently, we see this asymmetry. There's different kinds of resources and different costs to using a resource between two different competing adversaries. But what's really important to me about these adversarial settings is an assumption that the adversaries themselves are intelligent. So they have objectives or tactics or techniques for achieving these objectives in different ways. And they have to make selections over these techniques to achieve their objectives. And actually, quite often, the objectives are symmetric, right? One is just the inverse of the other. But more importantly, what I assume is that these adversaries are intelligent with respect to being able to adapt. I assume that two adversaries can learn. That's the key facet of their intelligence I want to study. It means that they can use the outcomes of their engagements and follow up their study of these outcomes with new actions that allow them to try to do better the next time they engage. And as a result of this learning and adaptation from experience, there's a stimulation of dynamics within these environments amongst these agents. And these dynamics can be oscillatory in terms of who at any time has the upper hand in the competition, or they can even escalate. They can be like arms races, where the strategies continue to improve with respect to each other time over time, and these adversaries build more and more effective and new novel strategies. Often, the arms races and these oscillatory dynamics, they don't just play out with a single pair of adversaries. Instead, they play out in an ecosystem of multiple players. And in this ecosystem, the objectives of each side are common to all the players of that side. But there's a really complex behavioral repertoire available to each side. So there's many ways to, in a sense, compete. And these strategies that are all different become variations in that behavioral repertoire of any sort of population that's competing in these adversarial settings. So before I tell you where you find these stylized settings in the wild, in real life, let me provide you with an outline of what I hope to talk about today. So I've just presented this very stylized paradigm of artificial adversarial intelligence. Remember, it's conflicting objectives, it's engagement and measurement of outcomes, it involves complex behavioral repertoires, and it involves adaptation. So what I want to do next is proceed to consider some natural settings where adversarial intelligence can be observed. And then we'll turn to computational intelligence. And for some of you, this will be a review, but to be collectively on the same page, I'll present an algorithmic model for adversarial artificial intelligence that I'm focusing on right now with my research agenda. And that'll be followed by a presentation of a framework my group is developing called Rivals. And it allows us to study adversarial dynamics with adversarial intelligence in the context of cyber networks and cyber attacks. And I'll include through Rivals a working example that will make everything a little bit more concrete. And then I'd like to wrap up and you know, having taken you through this trip of adversarial and introducing you to this idea of adversarial intelligence and computational adversarial intelligence, just to sort of flesh out for you other aspects of a research agenda around it that my group has been pursuing. So the first setting where I can give you an example of adversarial intelligence is finance and the realm of taxation. So I'm not sure that this would be your first example, but it's one that I've worked on. And in this case, consider that there's an engagement environment, which is the tax code and the action of tax collection. The tax code itself is this huge document. It's a set of rules that tell you and businesses how they must comply to taxation. But in all governments' cases, it has these really unobvious hidden loopholes. And with very complex behavior, they can be detected. So adversarially speaking, one side, you know, are non-compliant avoiders that consider financial structures taking advantage of the loopholes. And the other adversarial side is the government, which as a short-term measure decides to audit tax returns to figure out if they can detect and penalize tax avoiders. And of course, both sides have access to outcomes from their particular engagements. The government can observe what tax is being paid and what the taxation was and whether auditing detected any irregularities. And the avoider can observe the impact of the audit and get a measure of the success of their evading these taxes. So the information can be used by both sides to evolve. The avoiders change their financial structures, and the auditors change thresholds in areas where they target extra scrutiny. And arms race dynamics emerge in this real world adversarial situation, right? As the government in the US closes its loopholes, the new ones actually co-evolve. And adversarial avoiders find these loopholes and use them. And it's actually a very, very high value dynamics. In the US, just alone in one portion of the tax code, the US government figures there's a $91 billion gap. So we have a project called Stealth. It was developed over the space of 3 or 4 years. And it stylized and modeled and simulated this taxation setting of adversaries. And in terms of artificial intelligence, we developed a component that represented a set of the relevant tax code. That's what you see here in the block marked taxation system. And a second component shown here on the right, we built an AI that adapted avoidance and auditing strategies in response to each other, and that generated stylized coevolutionary dynamics in this taxation space. And while you may think it sounds very far-fetched, what we're quite proud to say is that recently we've learned that some parts of this system, in particular, you know, the mechanisms that we built, have been transitioned over to the government with the partnership of the sponsor of the project here in the US. So if you'd like any more information about the adversarial AI within the taxation system and this particular project called Stealth, please check out the publications page of my group's website. And I've also included a publication here. Now, how about another example? Another example of adversarial intelligence occurs within cybersecurity. Consider computer networks and systems where sets of actors we want to represent wish to protect themselves or their assets or the perimeter of their environment from the intentionally malicious behavior of attacking adversaries who seek to disrupt, steal, or invade them. Here's a basic example of an attack on a network. A botnet attacks a network with the objective of denying service to the enterprise that runs the network. That means that the enterprise no longer will be able to use its network to provide legitimate service to its customers. And the basic strategy of the botnet operator is to compromise a number of internet nodes and establish a command and control access back to the operator from these nodes, and then later come along and direct this coordinated attack that overwhelms the resources of the target. And it turns out, you know, this is one example of a botnet and a DDoS attack, but there's a very highly evolved ecosystem of cyber attacks related to botnets. And in fact, botnet operators, they don't just do this for themselves, they sell their services. And they adopt their bots. And what's been observed from a internet service provider is that not only are these malicious bots constantly evolving, the people developing them are actively looking for new evasion techniques, going so far as to hire developers with unique brand and vendor-specific expertise. So the dynamics that result from this bot landscape evolution are both alarming and fascinating. Well, fascinating purely from an academic perspective. Here's a chart from a report by a leading content delivery network provider. The x-axis is the attack and defense sophistication, and the y-axis is time. And what we can observe in gray is a curve where we see discrete and progressively more sophisticated bot techniques. And then in response, we see through adaptation, progressively more sophisticated defenses that have had to be designed in order to repel them. So we see this real co-evolutionary behavior emerging from the adversarial intelligence and adversarial actions and competitions going on in this cybersecurity space. And we're going to come back to this domain later because it really grounds my work in adversarial artificial intelligence. But before we do that, let's look at one other place where we see adversarial intelligence. It can be found in nature. Engagements play out in nature all the time, and they occur on an evolutionary timescale. And as a result, we see evolution of very powerful strategies for defense. And here's some natural examples of organisms that have evolved with this defensive goal entirely of not being eaten. So a skunk emits a bad smell to repel its prey. Chameleons and squids, that's the top right and the bottom left, they have evolved and learned essentially to change their color in order to camouflage themselves to defend themselves against predators. And plants, not even well, they're living organisms, but they're not animals, have grown thorns and spikes or become bad tasting or toxic as defensive measures. There are also natural examples of populations evolving to better eat or attack. And so the top here shows adversarial competition within a population. These are gazelles locked in fights using their horns. But the bottom row, right, shows the same species in competition with another species, where the gazelle is actually being hunted by an evolved predator that has evolved properties like speed and agility and a very powerful jaw in order to survive as an attacker. I think the bottom left picture is the most interesting. There is an attacker here, and it's hard to see it. You might think the attacker is the bee, right, or the wasp that you see in this picture, but actually it's not. The attacker, if you look closely, is a spider, and that spider is embedded in the middle of the flower, and it has evolved such an effective camouflage that it can sit on the flower, and when the flower attracts the bee, the spider is able to attack the bee. So what these examples demonstrate is biological adversarial intelligence, the learning of complex behavior and patterns. We're observing patterns of oscillatory dominance and arms races. And the driver behind all of this biological adversarial intelligence is the process of co-adaptation or co-evolution. And because of this fascinating and really powerful set of examples in biology, I'm motivated by a research question, which is, how can co-evolution be modeled in computational adversarial settings? And can adversarial intelligence emerge and be observed from the computational adversarial settings I model? And this really comes to explain how my team and I have come to use computational techniques that abstract evolutionary, competitive, co-evolutionary concepts. So now, with that sort of motivation and that introduction that I hope really persuades you that there is really interesting, complex intelligence within adversarial settings, and that there is some inspiration from biology to set up coevolution to replicate computationally the dynamics of adversarial intelligence. I wanted to move over to the computational side of my talk. So I use genetic algorithms to develop a computational version of coevolution. And a genetic algorithm stylistically models evolution and fitness-based adaptation. So there's processes of selection, there's processes of reproduction, and there's processes of variation within that reproductive process. The algorithm itself aligns only stylistically with biology. And just as an overview to everyone, in a genetic algorithm, we maintain a population of individuals in general. These individuals can be algorithmically assessed for their performance against some set of objectives. And they can be given a score, a fitness score. And what a genetic algorithm does is it runs those populations through that fitness assessment. And with those fitness values, the algorithm selects better solutions, and then takes those solutions and their genotypic representation and crosses them over and mutates them, and then uses those new genotypic definitions of children to repopulate the population for the next generation. So that's a very simple, quick overview of a genetic algorithm. And I bring it up because now we have to think about how coevolution occurs and how one computationally models coevolution. So a competitive coevolutionary genetic algorithm, which is what we desire here, is really two genetic algorithms fused together at their fitness evaluation step. So here we have two populations, a blue defender population and a red attacker population. And we want the GA to adapt both better defenders and better attackers, right? So to do this, we have, in a sense, two genetic algorithms that are running coupled with each other. The overall algorithm is modified to select one member of the defensive population and compete it against one member of the attack population, and to repeatedly do this many times so that the defender is tested against many different attackers. And then the algorithm is also modified to take one attacker out and compete it serially, one at a time, against many different defenders in the population. So as a result, each one of these two populations, the defenders and the attackers, are able to, for each member, have an estimate of the fitness of that member in terms of how well it competes against many different adversaries from the other population. And then what happens in a coupled genetic algorithm now is that after the evaluation step in a coevolutionary algorithm, we have two separate procedures, one which selects better defenders and one which selects better attackers. And each one of these selected sets of attackers and defenders then undergoes genetic variation and then is used as a replacement into the appropriate population they come from. So really a competitive coevolutionary algorithm, the way you want to look at it is it's centered on this ability to compete members of two different populations against each other and to use the fitness that reflects that competition in a really in an isolated genetic algorithm that runs in parallel with the genetic algorithm of the other side. Okay, so if we're in a quest of running such a genetic algorithm to replicate competitive coevolution to get the adversarial intelligence I'm seeking, then I have to think a lot about how I represent the intelligent behavior for each adversary. And in this case, what we've chosen to do technically is to represent members of a population, each of them, as an integer array. Just like the, an array of integers, but we accompany that array of integers with a grammar and an interpreter that uses the grammar and the array of integers to decode the array of integers into a complex behavior. So the actual behavioral repertoire of the attacker is expressed as language elements, and our grammar expresses how the language elements can be composed, and an integer array allows us to reference the grammar elements and put them together in a certain form so that we get a complex behavior being described for a member of the population. And we do this for both sides. It's a method called grammatical evolution. And the important part here is that we get systems where we can express the repertoire of intelligent behavior available to an adversary in a way that the domain expert can understand it, because the domain expert can identify actions and sequences of actions that an attacker or defender take. We can describe those through a grammar, and then we have a way with a genetic algorithm to decode integer strings to reference that grammar and actually interpret it into sophisticated attack or defender behavior. So that was a very quick introduction to competitive coevolutionary algorithms. I hope you can bear with me depending on your prior knowledge, or whether it be deep or less extensive. But what you should know is that to take away at a very high level is that if we want to study adversarial artificial intelligence, then we recognize that it's driven by a coevolutionary process, and we can develop coevolutionary algorithms which essentially model two populations competing against each other, and each of them independently evolving after the competition based on fitness-based information. So what we've done with my research group is to build a system, a framework called Rivals. And it's centered really on a competitive co-evolutionary algorithm and grammar-based behaviors, like I've just showed you. And its application focus is network security. And the goal of a network security framework is to help the defenders anticipate attack strategies given some sort of mission that needs to run on a network and some defensive configuration. And what Rivals does is it helps defenders consider the arms races that could occur when they make defensive changes and their attackers then evolve. And what that allows us to do with that sort of anticipatory knowledge is define and design effective courses of action so that the network can become more resilient. And what you see us setting up here then is a engagement environment, which is a network. And the two populations we're modeling, one is a population of cyber attackers, and one is a population of defensive strategies that are going to be deployed by network operators. So like Stealth, Rivals is composed of a pair of coupled high-level modules. One side, the one that you're seeing here on the left, co-adapts defensive and attack strategies, while the other, which you see on the right, the labeled engagement environment, is using modeling or simulation to compete an attack against a defense that has been configured over top of a predefined network. And the idea is that we know that the predefined network has some operational objectives, and we calculate how well the attack is able to disrupt the operational objectives of the network, and we calculate how well the defensive measures work in preventing the attack from doing so. So what you're seeing here is a module that is able to, on the left, select out from the attack and defense populations, essentially what we call controllers that can be sent over to the engagement environment module, which is running the network and the network mission. They can be instantiated onto those components. And after the mission is run and we measure the impact of the attack on the mission, we can send back from the engagement environment metrics that indicate the outcome of the engagement. And those will be used by this module on the left to formulate fitness scores and for the members of the two different adversarial populations. Now I'm going to dive a little bit into cybersecurity, and bear with me. It's the use case we have of Rivals. So in cybersecurity, one of the most pernicious and concerning threats that exist are called APTs, Advanced Persistent Threats. And they really are a kill chain. That's the terminology. And a kill chain is a sequence of steps, which we recognize now that attackers are taking to be able to exfiltrate data from a network. So these steps involve first gathering intelligence about a target network, figuring out how to initially exploit it by gaining access and a foothold within the network, assuming some portion of communication that goes back to a controller for the attacker, and then these part of the command and control is that once the attacker has entered the network, it tries to persist inside the network. And the step that we want to study in this entirely big kill chain is after an attacker has infiltrated a network and established persistence in the network. But before they actually start moving around the network and starting to do particularly malicious things within the network itself. And at this stage, where you see the arrow, what you see is the attacker has the goal of reconnaissance. That means it's going to scan as much of it's going to try to scan as much of the network as possible, find nodes that it can use as quickly as possible while avoiding detection. And with the purpose of learning the topology of the network, which particular configurations could be potentially vulnerable to a particular attack, and maybe perhaps identifying the location of valuable assets. So that's what the attacker wants to do. The attacker is already in the network, and they basically want to scan it and find out information about the network before they start moving around the network and doing something maliciously. The goal of the defense is pretty obvious in this case. It's to not necessarily recognize that they have been penetrated, but it's to detect and delay that particular action of reconnaissance, and to minimize how much the attacker can find out about the network. So the number of nodes the attacker can map. And this battle, this particular adversarial dynamics taking place where this arrow points out to, is very complex, and it has to usually take place in a very short amount of time. Because as soon as an attacker knows what's in your system, they're able then to exploit it through the command and control structure to move around the network and start to, escalate privileges and finally exfiltrate data. So we're focusing Rivals on trying to understand the arms race that takes place between reconnaissance attacks and defenses of reconnaissance attacks inside networks. Well, how does a network defend against these kinds of reconnaissance attacks? Reconnaissance scans. There's multiple ways to do it. Rivals studies one where the defense is deceptive. The idea of a deceptive defense is to represent fake but operational views of the network at different nodes, so that when the scanner is scanning, they will get fake information and they could be detected because they access a fake node that people who legitimately know about the network would never actually go to. So the deceptive network has routing information that can entrap a scan at a decoy node. It's often called, in cybersecurity terms, a honeypot. And as well, by sort of taking a network and expanding it. If you see here at the top, we have a network of 5 nodes, but the deceptive defense expands that network and puts in fake nodes and honeypots so that the reconnaissance scans can get caught in these honeypots, and they will be slowed down by visiting fake nodes on subnets. So this is a defense that you can't do with every network, but it's one that's actually possible with a very, very commonly used network called a software-defined network. Software-defined networks have the ability to administer a deceptive network view and then dispatch it to different nodes that are legitimate. And that allows the software-defined network to really distort the view of the network for any node and to designate these decoys. And it also allows the network to still process all the normal network traffic and reroute requests through this deceptive overlay of the real network and still provide service. So we have Rivals, and I mentioned to you that we have a network. Well, our network is modeled through a system called Mininet. And what we've got is on top of Mininet is we have a deception-capable SDN network that someone else wrote, but that we're now going to use as essentially to facilitate different deceptive strategies that can be searched by a population of network defenders. So the goal of this deception really is to minimize detection time and maximize the likelihood of detection. And the thing to remember is that, you know, each time a DHCP lease is renewed, the renewer is given a unique network view, and it inflates this address space, you know, and puts hosts on different subnets or in particular subnets. And the normal communication is supported, but it's a way of, you know, slowing the attacker down and possibly entrapping them. So it allows the defender some sort of defense against reconnaissance scans. So here's the tactical behaviors summarized here. What I've shown you in the middle here is the parts of the Mininet simulation where we have a deception server, and we're handling that network traffic and these deceptive network overlays. And now what I'm showing you is the attacker on the left. He's going to use scanning techniques, and members of the defending population will try and identify optimal deception system parameters. So the attacker, what they can do is they can pick how many IPs they're going to actually scan at a time. And we run a real emulation here. So we're using a process called Nmap in Unix to scan these IPs. And attackers can pick to do IP scans in different batch sizes. We have a discrete set of 4 of them. They can pick how many IPs they're going to visit total amongst these batches, and in what order they're going to address these IPs. Are they going to visit them randomly? Will they visit IPs around where the attacker is assumed to sit in the network? Will they go sequentially from their position in the network or from some other position in the network? What a defender can do is manipulate how many of the real nodes they map onto the deceptive network. They can say some range of honeypots they put per subnet in the deceptive network. They can choose a number of subnets in the deception layer, and they can figure out, they can pick different ways to distribute the real nodes amongst the fake nodes in these subnets. And so they can do these, we allow them to randomly place real nodes, or to place them equally in equal sizes amongst the different subnets, or to crowd them even on a single subnet. And what we're interested in is, you know, what is going to be the best strategy of an attacker if there's one particular defense, or what's going to be the best defense if there's one particular attack. And then we want to ask the really complex question, which is, if I allow both attackers and defenders to evolve against one another, will we see the same strategies emerge, or will we see different strategies emerge as being better than others due to the co-adaptation taking place as opposed to the single optimization taking place? So the intuition behind the fitness function for both the deception and the scanning attacks is how long it takes to run a scan, how long it takes to detect one, how many times in multiple efforts a defender can find a scan, and how many times the attacker found real nodes relative to fake ones. So relative to the total, given that there's some fake ones. And so we have this fitness objective that can be sort of flipped for the attackers and the defenders inside rivals. So I want to show you an example here. We're going to take rivals and we're going to specify 20 different static reconnaissance scan attacks. So we're going to enumerate different attacks, but we're going to assume that none of these attacks ever evolve into anything else. And for each one of those attacks, we're going to run our coevolutionary algorithm, but we're only going to allow the defenders to evolve and adapt. And what we're there effectively doing is we're finding the best defender for each of these 20 attacks. And we want to look at, across all these attacks, what is in common for the defenders, right? So we do this, and our hypothesis is that, you know, a good defense is going to be one which has lots of honeypots and lots of subnets and evenly distributes the hosts, right? We see this to some extent, regardless of the kind of attack we see. So what we have here is, in red, what you're seeing is attacks, and what you're seeing is, in blue, how the best defense that we found for each one of these attacks. And so you see here roughly, you know, enumerated, I think we've enumerated 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you know, so maybe 10 different attacks. And then for each one, we see the best evolved defender configuration. And then we took a look at what sort of was consistent across each of one of these. And we see, you know, that in general, how many nodes, you know, and these are particular networks we use, we see how many nodes should be used and implanted in the network, how many subnets you should put, and how many honeypots there are. So if you took this into account, you would recommend that you should create subnets where you put all the real hosts distributed across quite evenly across these new networks, right? And what you're going to assume is that the attackers are starting to scan their local subnet, and because you have your real nodes equally spaced across all the fake nodes, it's going to take them longer to find all of them, right? This makes a lot of sense because we're assuming that the attacker is static and we can optimize the defense. But let's flip the coin. And if we flip the coin, what we can do is we can say, well, let's allow all of our scanners to optimize through a genetic algorithm. And let's try and see what each one of them optimizes to for different defenses that don't undergo any kind of evolution, that they're static, right? And so now what you see is results that show that, you know, it's difficult to attack many honeypots and subnets, right? It's easier with a crowded distribution of real hosts to get a large reward when that subnet is scanned. So you know, it's really pointing to a general tactic for the attacker to adopt high risk and high reward tactics. And now what we're going to do, though, is we're going to run rivals with a co-evolutionary dynamic where both those populations are adapting at the same time. And we're going to look at the ensuing behavior and see whether we see a different kind of intelligence arise because the two systems are evolving with each other. And so how we did this was we did something called lockstep coevolution. And there was one case where we held the defense static and we allowed the attackers to evolve against it. Then we took the then we allowed the defense to evolve, and then we which allowed the, so that's what you're seeing here is in this point, in this period here, we allow the attackers to evolve, but the defenders typically take a longer time to respond. So at one point we then allowed the defenders to come on and adapt, and as soon as they did, they drove down the fitness of the attackers. But when we actually then held down the defenders and allowed the attackers to attack, we saw the resumption of new attacks. And so what you see here is this oscillation of attacks, and you see this sort of this normalization of them through the defenders. And the results are really interesting because it turns out that the optimal things to do are really sensitive to the rate of coevolution. So when the attacker is evolving really faster and we allow them to evolve like more frequently than the defender, which is kind of what happens because it's really hard as a network defender to evolve quickly, then the attacker picks very small scanning batch sizes. And the best response the defender can do is to distribute the real nodes randomly. But when we allow the defender to evolve faster or with more evolutionary generations, then the attacker's optimized batch size is actually 20 times larger. than the defender's best response, 20 times larger than it was when the attacker was evolving faster. And the defender's best response is to distribute real nodes evenly rather than randomly. And so, unfortunately, what emerges from this co-evolutionary modeling, as opposed to the static modeling where each side can optimize without the other, is that the defender is going to do significantly worse against an evolving attacker. And so one really has to be beware of these static assumptions. So I've included a paper reference here at the bottom if you want to know more. And I hope that I'll be able to convey to you the general notion that we have attackers and defenders. They're co-evolving. One side is scanning, one side is trying to deceive the other so that the scans are ineffective. And we see that the co-evolutionary dynamics point to different optimal behavior for the defender than if the defender was to assume that they were not evolving, or if they were to assume that the attacks were evolving. I'd like to acknowledge this particular set of work being done by a great group of Alpha team members. Alpha is the name of my research group. The work was led by Eric Hemberg, one of our research scientists, and both Jack Kelly and Michael DeLaus put in a lot of time to help us build these emulations of networks and to be fairly high fidelity with respect to, implementing real network scanning and implementing deceptive view, extracting the parameters of deceptive views so that we could search through different configurations to find optimal configurations for deception. And in general, the rivals framework is not just used for that one step in the APT kill chain. We've used it for different things. We've used it to look at how DDoS attacks can co-evolve against defenses on peer-to-peer systems. And we've also used it to look at how, under different enclaves being imposed upon a network, how defensive taps, those are sort of sensors that allow you to monitor potential attack activity, can be deployed in the case where there's some degree of contagion coming from attacks and their spread during lateral movement. So it seems to have served us well in a number of use cases in the domain of network security. So just to recap, we started off with me introducing you to artificial adversarial intelligence, very stylized paradigm. And then I said, well, that stylized paradigm is translated to very naturally occurring adversarial dynamics that we see, whether it be taxation or cyber dynamics or biology. And so I stepped off from there and said, well, let's look at the co-evolutionary process in biology because it is responsible for the adversarial intelligence emerging from these systems. So I introduced you to a competitive co-evolutionary algorithm and showed you one at work within a framework called Rivals. And so Rivals is a network framework that allows us to study cyber dynamics. And this one particular example we did was we looked at the co-evolution of deceptive defenses against scanning attacks. So what's your takeaway from all this? Because that's fairly complicated, and everything about co-evolution is complicated, and I'm aware that it's a tough thing to assimilate in in one sitting. I think that it's important to just see how complex co-evolution is, how it exists in both nature and society, and to really recognize that evolution underlies the adversarial intelligence we're seeing in so many places. I think that it should be possible from these ideas for anyone of the audience to identify their own co-evolutionary process of interest, because all around us we're surrounded by adversarial intelligence and adversarial dynamics. And this allows me to step back a bit. So I've built an agenda around artificial adversarial intelligence. And really what I've shown you here is the left-hand side of this agenda. we're taking machine learning approaches, in particular here of biologically inspired computation in the form of co-evolutionary algorithms. And we're using those algorithms to address the adversarial dynamics we see in the domain of network security. So I've shown you how we can model and simulate arms races for network security. But what we're also able to do is to evolve threats to networks and vulnerabilities to networks and use those to anticipate where we might look for attacks within networks. And that's a process called cyber hunting. And we're currently, as a group in Alpha, looking at how we can evolve threats by perturbing them and understand how that would indicate where we would hunt down cyber attackers within a network. But there's a whole other side to artificial adversarial intelligence that doesn't involve bio-inspired computation. I mean, the advantage of bio-inspired computation is it's less data dependent. It requires validation, but it's less data dependent. But there's an awful lot of data-driven learning approaches that can be brought to bear on studying artificial adversarial intelligence, in particular deep learning and optimization. And in this case, what my group is doing is we're using data-driven learning to not just detect malware, because malware is an adversarial activity, but to also understand how attackers can respond to malware detection by modifying their inputs to fool the malware detector. So we have a project that does that under the assumptions that the attack adversary can actually see the model that it's trying to evade. And yet we've also looked at black box attacks, and we're now looking at models of code and how they can be attacked and how we can counter the attacks on these models. So I just wanted to bring into focus an agenda that has a variety of learning approaches, some that are bio-inspired and some that are data-driven. And with that, I'd like to take questions if anyone has them.
Thank you very much for your talk. Oh yeah, there are already questions here, so maybe I can read them for you.
Sure.
Well, thank you for your talk. Says Pilar Gomez. My question is, how dependent is the result of co-evolution of rivals in a specific environment? That is, may the algorithm be trained with data obtained for a particular network and being used in another network environment?
Well, that's a great question. So if I understand it correctly, it's talking about this notion of transferability techniques, right? And I think that there's a certain amount of transferability and there isn't other transferability. So when we do something like deceptive networks, I think we have very domain-specific ideas about how the defense is set up and configured. And so in that case, configuring a different network defense for deception might depend a lot upon the complexity of the defensive shield. On the other hand, when we did something like model DDoS attacks against peer-to-peer networks, we abstracted the attacks to not necessarily be as low level, but we abstracted attacks to be in terms of what was targeted when and for how long in terms of denying service. And those sorts of attacks were effective at telling us about the quality of defenses in terms of how peer-to-peer networks manage data distribution and data replication, and how they manage their whole idea of how long they allow nodes to leave and then be reabsorbed into the network. So there was some transferability there. But each one of these projects was years of work to get the, to have a fairly computationally valid engagement environment in particular.
Right, okay. Thank you. There's another question here. In evolution, adaptability helps animals and plants to survive. Your system analyzes adversarial dynamics from from a genetic algorithm and optimization point of view, is it possible to use the genetic algorithm to select different defense mechanisms for the same attack mechanism and vice versa? I'm not sure.
Yes, in a sense, I was hoping to show some of that by taking rivals and when we turned off machine learning on one side and we kept it static, and then we optimized the other side, that allows us to select the different mechanisms for the same attack mechanism and find the best. And so yes, we're able to do that. I think the real lesson though is that if you allow for the fact that in an ecosystem, everybody is evolving with everyone else in response, like not just one side, then you see that different strategies are important, are perform better than others.
Right. Thank you. Another question here is, how do you evaluate the performance of an algorithm before its application? Is there any standard method?
Yes, there's a lot of work that precedes me in coevolutionary algorithms, and I really should give a shout out of recognition to the large amount of research that we sort of leveraged before we built these particular algorithms inside our own rival system. And it turns out to be really hard to figure out how to claim that an algorithm has good performance, because in coevolution, you're only really better with respect to who you face in competition, but who you face in competition continually changes. And so, one of the techniques you can do is you can kind of keep out from your algorithm every generation, you can keep out high performing competitors, and you can put them aside. And at the end, you can collect all the high performing competitors from each side, and you can have a big tournament where you compete them against each other, and you can see which ones emerge as the best. And so we've been doing that, but that doesn't quite speak to your question of performance evaluation. What people look for is they look for progress in the algorithm, or is the algorithm getting stuck? Is it converging to just one set of solutions or not? And so a lot of the things we did was we set up easier problems that we had a lot more control over and that evaluated for fitness quite easily, and that we had a very, very simple network, for example, as well. So we built a much simpler and controllable parameterized environment and set of behaviors, and then we tested the algorithm under those conditions so that we could see how it was performing according to, whether it was performing according to expectations under conditions we could control.
Right. Just two more questions here. Do you think deep learning networks other than GANs could take advantage of adversarial learning approach?
Well, so it's an incredibly, we have a system where we have combined coevolutionary algorithm mechanisms with GANs, generative adversarial networks. And it works superbly, I must say. It's called Lippinzahner, and if anyone wants to know more about it, contact me and I'll point you to a whole selection of literature on Lippinzahner. And that's because, GANs, generative adversarial networks, are set up that the generator and the discriminator compete with each other, and the learning signal of each of them is fed back so that they can sort of, co-evolve, but they're doing it through gradient-based learning. And when you map that to coevolution, what you can take advantage of is you can have populations of generators and populations of discriminators. And in order to make that computationally efficient, we sort of map those populations onto a two-dimensional grid, which allows us to, take the complexity of the algorithm down. So are there other deep learning networks there? I want to see adversarial learning. I don't think I know of any, but it could just be that I lack imagination. And so if you can think of one, or anybody else in the audience can think of one, we should all get together and chat a little bit about it.
And the final one, are there some research projects in alpha related with the application of artificial adversarial intelligence to the understanding and modeling of biological systems, particularly the modeling of cancer and white blood cells as adversarials in a biological system?
Well, I just wanted to, before I answer this, just remark on how great these questions are. And they're fabulously sophisticated. Thank you so much for pushing me on them. When you ask me this question, I go automatically to a field inside computational intelligence, which is nature inspired, called artificial immune systems. And artificial immune systems do model both cybersecurity, and they actually do a lot more biological modeling as well. And they are bridging to more sort of compartmental type models that you might see for modeling cancer and white blood cells traditionally. But I have not within Alpha done any work on modeling biological systems. We do work on helping neuroscientists interpret their data. And we have a neuroscience colleague, and she's studying neural activation patterns in mouse brains. And that results in her sort of breeding mice with particular mutations, and then at certain points in their development, slicing up, getting brain slices and actually trying to dynamically look at the neural activity. And as a group, Alpha is looking at how we can help them very quickly quantify and label that neural activity, but we haven't been doing it in an adversarial setting.
And the final one, maybe is related. Is there another biology-based algorithm to try this kind of problems?
Right. Well, I think artificial immune systems could be used to look at cybersecurity problems. There are, game theory can be used to look at cybersecurity problems. Each one of these paradigms, which considers adversarial, stylized adversarial settings, brings a certain kind of algorithmic technique to the problem, and game theory simplifies some of the very complex factors you see in real adversarial environments. On the other hand, it gives us a very clear, abstract understanding of payoffs and particularly optimal strategies. Artificial immune systems also have done work which show different ways of self and non-self and doing a form of anomaly detection. So I would suggest both of those as being alternatives to co-evolutionary algorithms. But I think that each one of these algorithm techniques has different benefits. And the one that I see coming out of co-evolution is this ability to emulate, simulate, and actually have engagements with really complex asymmetric objectives and asymmetric resource use and sets of actions by players. And so it strikes strikes closer to the heart of the real adversarial systems. On the other hand, it becomes much more complex fast, and it lacks the same sort of formal clarity that you might see with game theory.
Right. Thank you very much. I think, yeah. Well, there's one here. Which are the most advanced techniques in NLP? I'm not sure if they refer to natural. NLP are you using for your research? NLP?
Well, so if that's natural language processing,
that should be, yeah.
It turns out we are actually using natural language processing models. And we've been using these attention models of late. We're not using ones that you get off, we are using some that you get off the shelf, but we haven't been in particular interested in attacks on these models. We've been interested in attacks on code models. And so the way to think about that is to go back and think about search-based software engineering in the evolutionary computation community. And there you start to use programs as data. And this is being done all over. So we have Git repositories full of code. And it's possible to now go to these repositories and build representations of these code repositories. And then with these representations, you can take any new piece of code, and if you have a label for it, you can get the representation of that code, and using the representation of that code and its label, you can, downstream build a classification model or something. And so you might then be able to build models that can find bugs in code, or that can classify code functionality and suggest names for code. So we are interested in these sort of derivatives of NLP models that are used for representing computer programs. And we're using attention models for that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was the last question. So we would like to thank you again for your time and your talk. Very interesting. And well, that would be it. Thank you very much, Dr. Una.
All right. It was my pleasure. It was nice to meet everyone.
Thank you. I think the rest of the organizing committee is here, but wow, okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
I think she's okay.
¿Ya se fue?
No, I think it only closed the video, so creo que todavía está ahí. Pues nada más, bueno, al resto de los participantes, ¿verdad? Sí, al resto, a los participantes que aún están por ahí, continuamos con las actividades a las 3 de la tarde. A las 3 de la tarde serían las últimas conferencias plenarias del día de hoy. Agradecemos su presencia en esta conferencia magistral. Muchas gracias.
Bye bye.
Chao.
A comer.
Bye.
Nos vemos al rato.